Hello, welcome to Human Tech, a podcast about the intersection between humans and technology. My name is Guthrie. I'm here with Susan. Hey, Susan.
Hello.
Uh, for those of you watching the live stream, I am wearing all red today, and you
Well,
were giving me a
one
hard
could
time for the
argue
podcast
about
because
what colors you're wearing,
it's
but
too
yeah.
red. So I put on a hoodie to cover my red shirt, but it's a maroon hoodie, and
Yeah,
not
I
happy
mean,
with me.
yeah, we're not going to win fashion awards for this podcast,
I think unicolors, solids, just like all one color is very in right now. So.
which you are not wearing. I'm wearing
Well, I've been
a
lawyered.
black shirt.
I've been lawyered.
Hopefully the majority of our audience is listening and not watching today.
That's right.
Anyway, okay, you're
Yeah.
very colorful. That's good.
Thank you.
So, when we left off in our last episode, we were doing a little series here, and we were talking about mental and conceptual models. Do you remember that,
Yep.
Guthrie? Or are you
Yep.
purposely trying to forget?
Yes, this is going to be part two.
Part two of that
Part.
conversation,
This is of that conversation, but part many of our lecture
part many of
series.
all these series,
Yeah. Yep.
we're
Yep.
doing
So this is going to be the conceptual models, part two,
conceptual
and
models. Yeah,
we left it off
yeah,
last time
yeah.
talking about objects and views.
Yes,
Uh,
but actually, we left it off where I told you I was going to tell you the origin story about.
As a quick summary, if you did
Yeah.
not listen to section one, conceptual models are conceptual. And I
Well,
know that
that
means
was
that
really good,
we
Guthrie.
we sort of determined that the reason it's so hard is because it's about the art of trying to say what goes where, and that's very difficult to do. Objects are literally all nouns, and so it's just you use the same concept whether you're designing a toaster or a web app, and you just those things are just not they're not the same. And I think
Right.
human brains have trouble wrapping their head around something so vague, so huge.
As abstract, it's a level of
Abstract, that's the
abstraction
word.
that's challenging. It
Yep.
is,
Okay,
but critical.
so now let's go into all of the gritty details.
Okay. But first, a story about children at play.
Okay.
So many years ago, I believe this goes back. Ooh, I should have looked it up. I've been trying to find this video that I watched once, Guthrie, a long time ago, about this. And so far, I haven't been able to find it. But I think this goes back to either the late 1970s, probably the 1970s. So, do you know anything about the organization called Xerox PARC?
I
PARC.
I know all about Xerox PARC.
Okay. So, PARC, which stands for, I think, Palo Alto Research Center. So, Xerox
It is Park with a C, not a
PARC with a
K.
C. Yep. So, Xerox, is Xerox still around as a
They
company?
are,
Okay.
for sure.
So, Xerox, which has been around a long time, had a research group in Palo Alto, and they did research on all kinds of things. And essentially, they were researching user interfaces before they were called user interfaces. And this is before graphical user interfaces. This is when you've communicated with a computer or an app by typing in on a command line. And they were asking the question, is there a better way for people to communicate with computers besides just typing in lines of code? And interesting people that they decided to do some basic research on how people interact with stuff. And they decided they did some research with adults. They brought adults in and would lay objects out lay things out on a table, a block, a pair of scissors, a pencil, or whatever. And they would just ask people to do tasks and they'd watch what they were doing. And they found that they weren't really getting very far with the adults because the adults felt very uncomfortable being watched and they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And so they decided this might work better with children. So they brought in children, everything from toddlers up to maybe about age 7, and they would put them in a room with stuff, with toys and blocks and whatever, balls, and they just observed how the children interacted with things. And this is where they came up with the idea that the most natural way that most of the time people, and then they did test this again with adults, but the most natural way most of the time that people interact with stuff is is well, there's two ways. One is that sometimes you just see something interesting and you go over to it and you pick it up and then you do something with it. Okay, so that's method number one. I don't have anything in particular in mind, but I see something. Oh, what's that? I go over, I pick it up, and then I go, oh, I wonder if this is like some kind of, puzzle block. And then you start doing something with it. The other way that they noticed that people did things with things is they would see the thing, uh, or they would think ahead of time, either before they saw it or after they saw it. I wonder if there's something here that I could use to do this. And then they'd look around and look for the something, and then they'd go find it and they would pick it up and then decide, yeah, this would work. And then they would use it. So they were essentially thinking about objects and actions, was what they came to realize they were doing. They were dealing with objects and they were dealing with actions. And some of the time, people, especially adults, had in mind a task they wanted to do ahead of time and then would look for the object to do that task on and then look for the method to take the action. And sometimes, especially with kids, there wasn't any planned task. There was just looking around and seeing an object that grabbed your attention, going over to it, picking it up, and investigating what it could do. But either way, one of the most important things I think that came out of their, this is what we call basic research, generative research. One of the most important things that came out of it is that whether or not you had a particular goal in mind, people tended to be, when they were looking in their environment, very object oriented, very much focused on, oh, what am I working on? There, that's what I'm working on. And then after that, deciding exactly what action to take with that thing, even if you had a higher level abstract task you were trying to do. So when they started working on graphical user interfaces, they thought about and planned and did some work on making sure that the object, the thing that someone was going to take an action on, that it was very obvious what the thing was. So that objects were very clear, because in their view, that was how people were really starting, even if they had a task in mind. And this was the beginning of building in, an object oriented viewpoint into design at an interface level. Now, I want to mention that the whole idea of object oriented programming, not from the interface level, but from the design of software, that went on even before this. So, can I do a side rant? Am I allowed to do that?
Yes, and then I also I have an aside, which is just
Okay.
interesting. But
So, my aside rant is that there are currently some people, and I will leave names out of it unless you want me to name names. There are currently some people out there who are working on and teaching object oriented user experience design, who claim that they invented the whole thing. And and they invented it within the last 10 years. And I have actually tried to communicate with these people and let them know that there's a very long history about object oriented programming and object oriented interface design. I mean, it might not be called back in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't necessarily called object oriented UX because the term UX is newer than that, but definitely is object oriented interface design and object oriented UX. It goes back a really long way. And there are books that were written about it. A lot of techniques and, a lot of, not a lot of people, but some people, I'm one of them, teaching it going all the way back to the 1990s. So this isn't a new thing, but it is not necessarily particularly well known. And I think it goes back to what we said at this top, which is it's because it's not easy to do. So I have a lot more I'm going to say about this whole thing and how it applies and what you do with it in the modern day. But you said you had an aside too. Go ahead, Guthrie.
Um, it's just about Xerox and Xerox
Yeah.
Park.
Yeah.
Such a fascinating history.
Yeah. Why? What do you know about it?
So it's really interesting because we might be seeing, how do I explain this? In the US, there are these economic eras that just kind of happen, and they're
Yeah.
usually demarcated by some sort of
Economic disaster.
yeah, some sort of giant recession.
Recession or
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And there are these behemoths, and the
Big
behemoths are so
companies, you mean?
large. Yeah, big companies that just are they were the future, then they
Yeah.
become the present, and then they become sort of
Not the present, not the
or not the
future or
present.
the present. Yeah.
Things change, and they kind of flail around,
Yes.
and
Definitely.
some of them um, dissolve and all but name.
Yes.
So Kodak would be
Kodak.
one
Yes.
enormous company,
Yes.
and they're
They're
still
still
around,
around.
but like they're like a
They're a
a
little there's
hundredth of their former size. I mean, they're
well, if any of the Kodak people are listening, they're probably now gonna
no, it's just that's
it's
just the
true.
truth. I mean, it used to be one
Yeah.
of like the anyways.
Largest companies. Yeah. Okay.
Um, there are and so the behemoths kind of come with the technology that then passes by.
Yeah.
The same could be said about radio. The most of the radio companies got into television,
Yeah.
so like the ABCs of the world, or
They morphed. Yeah.
they're still around.
Pivoted. Yep.
So sometimes they can pivot successfully, and they just kind of keep going.
Yep.
Sometimes they try to pivot, and it just like
Doesn't work.
kind of doesn't work.
Yeah.
Um, sometimes they pivot, and it kind of doesn't work, and then they can shift lanes because they're flexible enough, and they can find a groove, and they can kind of
Yeah. They can
stay
come
on their feet
back.
for a little
Yeah.
bit. So, we did the first wave was not the first wave, but like the wave that I'm sort of curious about was all the printers and the photocopying and the photography behemoths,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
is the Polaroids,
HP, Polaroid,
HP,
Kodak,
and Xerox.
Epson, and
Yep.
Xerox.
Now there is still a market for printers and printing. Um, and many of the
Mhm.
companies, HP still makes you have an HP
Mhm.
printer there
I
behind you,
do.
and
Yep.
they have an ink
Right
thing,
behind
and
me.
it's a business line, but it's not like it was in the 80s where it was
Right.
just this dominant,
Gigantic. Yep.
enormous money
Yep.
thing. And Xerox is certainly part of that. Obviously, we call it a Xerox machine,
Machine. I know.
right? That's a euphemism back when they ran the show
Yep.
in a lot of ways. So um, I only bring it up because you know we also had the early PC behemoths,
Yes.
Microsoft,
Yep.
IBM, which I mean I know they're really early, but they transitioned into the
Yep.
PC world well
Yep.
enough. Um, I guess Dell, I suppose.
Yep.
Um, HP, were they big in personal computing? They
Not
were
early on, no.
not early on. Who am I missing? Am I missing?
Compaq.
Compaq. Compaq is
The
now
Altos, Altos.
Compaq is now Dell.
I think so. I don't know.
How do you spell Compaq?
Compaq.
Q. I always it's like, is it a K? Is it a Q? Um, Prior to its merger, who they HP.
Yeah,
They
that's what I
merged with
thought. They're
HP. So
okay.
so that's why I thought that's why I thought that HP was in the personal computing business,
No,
because they were, but they just own Compaq's
right.
personal computing business. So sometimes and now we get to the big behemoths of the modern,
Oh,
not the
do you,
modern era,
do you know
but
who had, who was pretty big in the personal computer world?
no.
Zenith.
Oh yeah, Zenith. Yeah.
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 I
I
used to
mean
use
Zenith
A Zenith personal
th-
computer. They even had uh, portables, if you can
I mean
call it that.
they made
They
like
weighed like
TVs and
yeah, Zenith
radio and
TV. They got into the whole cathode ray CRT monitors. I used a Zenith
how do you spell Zenith?
Zenith. I used a Zenith portable computer, I believe, once that weighed like 40 pounds. We just thought it was so cool. Literally 40 pounds. I mean, you used to haul it around. Anyway, I'm
Well, yeah,
showing.
they're part of the old wave, which is the radio wave, and
Yes,
I forgot there were a couple giants from that
yes,
era.
yes. From
Zenith is
radio
one,
that went into
RCA
TV, that went
is
RCA.
yep,
Yes.
Radio Shack
All
being
right,
sort of
let's
another.
let's move on.
So now we get to the newer. Then now there's like the newest wave, and
Yes,
they're old, and
yes.
it's Apple,
Apple. Yep.
it's Google, and
Yes.
it's Facebook, and
And
like it or
Microsoft.
not. Oh, no, well, Microsoft's they're part of the previous wave.
Okay.
You know, they're back. They belong in the Dell category
Yeah.
of
Okay.
companies. And maybe Apple too, but they were never big like they are now. Um and I guess Amazon you can put in that list, though
Okay.
they're it's a little different. But Google's 20 years old, At
I
this
know.
point we're getting to that point
Getting to that point. Yeah. When they might stumble.
they were the up and comers, and now
Yeah,
they were
they might.
here,
I
and
don't know.
now
I don't know.
what's gonna right? Like there's really not a
So
future in search browser
one of the
stuff.
things that I find so interesting too about these transitions, and this goes, I'll go back, right? I'll take us back around to Xerox PARC and object oriented interfaces because um, coming up with this idea about object oriented interfaces is actually what allowed us to move forward with the conception or the conceptual model of a graphical user interface
Hmm.
of things on a screen that you click on and you move and you grab and so on. Um, and that, Apple made that pretty popular with their personal computers early on, but that was actually invented by Xerox. So
Hmm.
Xerox had the first graphical user interface. Um, by the way, the whole thing of a mouse, where you move something and you point, and you click on it. The whole thing about drag and drop, which is this particular kind of interaction that was invented by Xerox, and it was invented coming out of that research watching. Back to the children, they noticed that when the children were trying to move a large object that they couldn't just pick up and move, like you can pick up a small ball and move it. But when they wanted like this gigantic block, they would go over to it and grab it and drag it. And that's actually where drag and drop comes from. It comes from a 5-year-old trying to move a big foam block across the room. And I love that. I love that.
That's great.
I wish we did more research like that, watching people in, non-digital environments and how they interact with objects and thinking about what does that mean we should do with the digital object. So, all right. So I want to come back then, Guthrie, and talk about this idea of objects because it's big, it's important, it actually is not brand new, and I think it is one of this whole and it's critical to what we were talking about with conceptual and mental models in our last episode in the series. And it's something that for because of the fact that it isn't easy to work with, it's not used a lot, it's not done a lot, and I think that's when I see software and apps that are hard to learn or hard to use, I would say 70% of the time, I'm just picking this off the top of my head, 70% of the time or more, the reason that it's failing is because the objects and the views and the actions were not well designed. In fact, probably nobody stopped to do that level of design, and that's why it's failing. I mean, I just see this over and over and over. So, um, if you want a product to be usable and easy to learn and easy to use, you got to spend time deciding what objects are you going to have people work with at each point that they're interacting with this product. What are the different views that they can have on that object, and what are the different actions they can take on the object? This is called, object-oriented design. So, can I give you an example? I'd like to give you a couple examples, and maybe you have some questions to ask about. Maybe you can give some examples, and we can discuss them too, Guthrie. I'm going
Yes, just to put one other fun fact about Zenith.
to about oh, you're going back. Okay,
In the 70s, they
yeah,
invested in a little known company in Korea
called.
called Gold Star,
Okay,
and Gold Star
yeah,
grew
yeah.
and became LG
Oh,
Electronics,
really?
which later, like 2 decades later, then bought Zenith.
Oh, that's so funny.
Isn't that
Wait
funny?
a minute. How do you invest? Oh, because they invested, but they hadn't acquired them.
Mhm.
Oh, how funny is that?
Something like that. Yeah,
I
I'm sure
didn't
there's
know
a
that. That's what
yeah.
happened to
So
Zenith.
Zenith is owned by LG.
All right, I like it, and it lives on.
Well, I don't think
I had a
so.
Zenith TV once too. Okay, so let's give some. I think we need to make this concrete. So
Yeah.
let's give some examples.
Okay.
So I think most people listening, maybe not all, but most, use some form of an online calendar program, right? Outlook or Google or something, right? So thinking about a calendar program, and this is an example that actually is pretty easy to understand and is not as abstract as some. So when you are using a calendar program, whether you are uh, looking at what you got going on that day, or whether you're setting up a new appointment with someone or putting something on your calendar, there are objects that you are looking at and taking action on. Do you want to take a guess, Guthrie, as to what are some of the objects, some of the important objects that you're interacting with when you use an online calendar?
Again, objects are nouns.
Nouns.
So an online calendar, uh,
Hmm.
I'm gonna say there's. I mean, if you want to call it the calendar, the rows and columns that make up
The
the
calendar
day.
itself. Hmm.
Uh, you're gonna need a series of buttons to sort of
Well,
do things.
no, that's not. I mean, there are buttons, but in terms of the conceptual model, we wouldn't talk about the buttons because we're not talking about what you see on the screen. We're talking about conceptually. What is it you want to manipulate when you use an online calendar? You don't necessarily want to manipulate a button. I mean, you're going to end up doing something with a button, but that's the method. What are you trying to do with the
Well,
calendar?
okay. The verb is the action
Hmm.
that you need to do is you need to be able to add things to a calendar,
Oh, what are the things you're adding to the calendar?
events.
Aha. So that's your object. So calendar itself is an object. Events or appointments or whatever it is you call them, that's an object. And then
What
there's
do you call
action. Mhm.
so what do you call the menu, right? There's gonna be some sort of menu where you can do things.
Yeah, okay,
How does that
great,
fit in with an
great,
object in a
great
view?
distinction. So we're going to make a distinction between the things you really want to do. Um, we use the term agnostic. That's probably a terrible term. The things you want to do, regardless of the particular technology you are using. So a menu is a technology of your interface. A menu is just a technique we use to allow you to take actions on the object you want to take actions on. You do not go to a calendar and say, "Oh yeah, let me see what my menus." No, that's not what's in your head when you're going to the calendar. You're thinking about appointments, you're thinking about weeks, you're thinking about months, you're thinking, right? You're not thinking about menus or buttons. Those are just the means by which you take actions.
So what you're saying is that when it comes to actions, when it comes to conceptual models, we're not counting things that are in all apps. We're not
Correct.
counting things that are in part of it. If it's a Windows application, we're not counting the start menu at the
Right, or
bottom of
the
the screen
pop-up window, right?
because that is required. That's
That
part of the
we're it's
application,
part of it,
but
and we're gonna
but
need
there's
it.
nothing special about
It's
that.
not it that part is not part of the conceptual model. That's part of our technology, of how we get our stuff done. But, you know, I should be able to design a whole calendar system at a level of abstraction where it doesn't matter that I don't know if I'm doing it on a laptop, a desktop, uh, a a mobile, or a voice interface, right? Because if I'm using a voice interface, I'm not using buttons. I'm not doing a menu. Doesn't matter, right? So we're at a level abstraction above the particular technology you're using. Yeah, it's it's different. So all the Windows stuff and all the Apple, Mac, uh, operating system and all the iOS and all the Android and all those little things you in the plus sign and the the caret that drops something down. None of those things are objects in the way I'm using this. Okay.
Yep.
So let's go back to the calendar because you said there was a calendar and you said there were events on the calendar. And then there's going to be actions, right? That I'm going to take. So, what kind of actions am I going to take on, for instance, an event? So, event is an object. So, what are the actions I want to take on that object?
Um, well, w- an event, I mean, you have to be able to theoretically add,
I
remove,
want to add a new
change.
event. I want to change an event. I want to look at the event. Right. So, we have objects, we have actions that we want to take on those objects. And then we have one more really important piece of the conceptual model, and that's decisions about the views of the object. So, again, thinking about a calendar, let's think about the object called the calendar, right? Um, what are the different ways you might want to view the calendar? So we have Guthrie's calendar. What are the different ways you might want to view that? What are the different views you might want to have on your calendar?
Week,
You might
month,
want to view it weekly,
day,
daily. You might want to view it
year,
daily, year, month.
hour, just segments of time, right?
Segments of time, right. So you want to be able to look at it in different segments of time. What are other ways that you want to view? Because calendars these days can get kind of interestingly complicated.
Well, theoretically, you'd have multiple calendars that you could smush into one thing.
So you might have your personal calendar and your work calendar, and you want to view where you see it all, but you might also want, right, to filter just select items, right? So you might want a filtered view. So what we do in conceptual model design is we map out what are the main objects, the most important objects that people are going to want to interact with when using this product and doing whatever the task is that they want to do with it. What are the main objects? What are the different views we are likely to have on that object? And what are the different actions that people want to take on the different views of the different objects? And if we map that out and we know that, we can now design a flow of actions and screens and pages. And now we can make decisions about menus and buttons to match that conceptual model that we built. So that's what the conceptual model is. It's the objects, it's the views, it's the actions, and it's the flow through the different views. And it gets, hint, hint, it gets more complicated than that, but that's the basics of it. Can we take another example besides the
Sure.
calendar?
Sure.
You want to think of one? What's a task you do online or an app you use frequently?
Read the news.
Okay, so so reading the news is interesting. Um, you've heard of information architecture.
Yes.
So this thing I just described with objects and views and actions, I call that task architecture. And it's related to but different from information architecture. And the interesting thing about reading the news, so let's talk about it. What are the objects? What are the important objects?
There's going to be articles,
Articles.
sort of stories in some way.
Okay.
There's going to be probably the, maybe sections
Okay.
that you would, peruse through.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to have articles. And so now we get, all right, now we get into some interesting things. And this is where you get to the point of creativity and different designers making different decisions that's going to affect the design they come up with. So I could say to you, Guthrie, that uh, articles and sections are the same object, just different views of it. I could argue that. You may or may not agree with me. And if you designed it so that they were different objects and with different views of each object and different actions on each object, and I designed them as though they were the same object but different views, we'd come up with two different interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
And that's valid. There is no one right way to design this, but some ways are probably better than others. But yeah, we can have sections. But the thing that I think is interesting, if you think about the actions and views in reading the news, it's probably pretty monochrome. Basically, you just want to get to the information you're interested in and then read it. And then you want to browse to other information you're interested in and then read it. And
Right.
so it becomes more of an information architecture than it does a task architecture, because the task is not extremely complicated. The task is find something I'm interested in and read it, right? So in that case, we get more into things like how to organize the information in a way that makes sense, which really, that's the heart of information architecture. So it's
Yeah, I mean, so
related.
that's a that I pick that's a so what you're saying is that doing simple things like browsing a website is very whatever.
It's a conceptual model. It's
It's
just
very simple.
it's a fairly simple
Browsing the
conceptual model.
news.
And the tricky part that there is just, oh my gosh, we have so much information and how are we going to organize it? And that's information architecture. And I do not mean to minimize the importance of information architecture because it's critical. But I think, maybe this isn't true. I think it's easier for designers and developers to understand that they need to deal with the information architecture and that that's important. And they I mean, I'm not saying they always do a good job at it, but they kind of know that that's a step they need to do. Hey, maybe we better look at the information architecture. Whereas the other piece, the task architecture, the conceptual model for task oriented um, products is usually ignored. So that's why I shine a special spotlight on conceptual models for that, for more complicated tasks. All right. I want you to pick another one.
Um, yeah, let's maybe pick something that's harder, I suppose, huh?
More task oriented.
Does it have to be digital? It would probably have to be digital.
It'll help us if you use a digital example. Yeah.
Um, buying airline tickets.
Buying airline tickets. Okay. Let's take a look at that. So let's talk first about some of the major objects. This is an interesting one. This will get us into some nuances. Let's talk about what some of the most important objects are when you're trying to buy airline tickets. What do you think they are?
I guess that's gonna be. So, how do you deal with something where there are multiple steps?
Yes.
Because the calendar, it's all just one page.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you deal with something that goes, you start here,
Mm-hmm.
and then you do this thing, and
Mm-hmm.
you go to the next phase, and you go to the next
Yeah.
phase?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to deal with that. And so that now we're talking about task flow. We're talking about the steps the person wants to go through in order to buy the airline tickets. And there's the steps they think they want to go through based on their mental model, right? And their mental model is based on how they've been doing it for the last, X number of years. Uh, so this is why we do task analysis before we start designing. It's like, okay, so what is their mental model? So their mental model is that they're going to take these steps. And in fact, typically what we do when we're doing conceptual model design is we map out the current task analysis and then we analyze that for likely objects. We just literally look through the task analysis and identify the nouns. Literally. I used to teach this. I still do, but I haven't taught this in a while. But you teach this by saying to people, okay, here's the task analysis, or you make them create it, or you give it to them. And you say, now take a blue pen and circle the nouns. And I always joke with them, like, remember when you were in middle school and Mrs. Smith told you one day you'll need to know this, that day is now, right?
Yeah.
So circle the nouns, and then I make them get like a red pen and draw a line underneath the verbs. So now we have the nouns and now we have the verbs. And so then we can go through and figure out a couple things. What are the most important objects? So let's say we had that. What do you think? So the steps are they're important, but you will want at some point to stop and say, well, that's how they're used to doing it now. But now we know these are the objects and the actions they want to take. Is there a better way to do it? Should we try and match their mental model? Or is there something new we could do that might be better? I mean, that's when you can step back and ask that. And then when you go to actually put these objects and actions into play, you do what I call a screen flow diagram and you map out, well, okay, the first object they're going to deal with is, you know, a, they're trying to buy a ticket. They're trying to get a ticket. They're trying to purchase a flight. So they've got, you know, a trip. That's an object, is the trip. And here's the steps they want to follow. Okay, so what do they need to know about the trip? What do they need to see about the trip? What is the view of the trip? And you actually map that all out. So the steps are very, very important, but they're not exactly the same as the objects, because you can show the objects and different views of the objects in a different order. So what are the objects when you're trying to buy an airline ticket?
Well, so I mean, yeah, at some point you have to search for stuff.
Well, search is
Obviously,
not an object.
that's not an object. That's an
That's
action.
an action.
You're gonna have prices.
Yes.
You're gonna have flight information.
What does that mean?
The names of the planes and the times that they leave and the different options. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
options. I guess options is a verb or as a noun.
Options, like what kind of options?
Um,
Options is a noun.
sort of like, sort of like the different times of day that the flights run, the different
Okay.
routes, the
How many stops
information, the
it
types of
has,
planes.
how long the layover is.
Mhm.
So when you have a lot of stuff like that, those things aren't major objects. Those are sub objects, or we could even call them attributes. So if you collect them together, Guthrie, if I'm looking at how long is the layover, how many stops are there, which city is it going through, right?
Mhm.
Those are all pieces of what? Because I'm not going to be thinking. I mean, I am thinking about those details, but I don't want to have to deal with all those details separately. So as the human, I think of that as what? What's
I
the
do not.
object? The
I don't know.
major object.
I don't know. What's the object?
I mean, there's not one right answer. It could be the trip,
The
the
trip.
itinerary,
Hmm.
the my flight path. That's going to be the object, and so what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make choices about all these attributes for my object. One thing that might be nice that you typically can't do at the airline websites is, I'd like to be able to build this trip over here, assuming I go through Chicago. And then I'd like to build another trip where, no, I don't go through Chicago on American. I go through Minneapolis on Delta. And it would be nice to be able to view those side by side, right? And you can't do that. So it's complicated, and sometimes they make good choices about objects and views, and sometimes the airline websites don't. So, for instance, for me, because I am a control freak, the particular seating options for a particular flight, I am very interested in, and that is going to affect which flight I take. And yet, it's not easy to find that because they don't think that's an important attribute or particularly important. And for me, it's a very important attribute. So I would like to be able to see that attribute more easily. I might be an outlier, so maybe we don't design for me. But if you identified what are the main objects and what are the different views that you might have on that object, And then what are the actions that people need to take on each view? And if we had that identified, now we could play around with here's alternative A of how we might design this. Here's alternative B. Here's alternative C. And then we have to decide, maybe we even, do we let people switch their views? Could we do that? Is that a good thing for people to do, or is that just going to confuse them? Do we let people filter their views?
Hmm.
Right? So that's what you do with a conceptual model. And I think that's a good one, back to the thing we mentioned last time about whether we design to match their current mental model. Because I think, with something like airlines or searching for a hotel or any of those travel things, there are some pretty strongly set conceptual models that we've all developed mental models on. I don't know if you remember, you may not remember this, Guthrie, when Kayak first came out, or Expedia, or any of those travel aggregators, because that was new. And
Yeah.
those were different conceptual model designs, because
Well,
now,
yes and no.
mm,
Yeah, they were kind of being like a travel advisor.
they were being a travel advisor. And the fact that it was, because before that, you had to go to each individual airline site. So it was very hard to compare American versus Delta for that route. Uh, even I think even still on most of the airline, at least the
Southwest.
pardon?
Southwest still has all their stuff on one place. And yeah, but you're right. Most of the airlines like or hotels do this where our best deals
Yeah,
are on, if you go to so and so.com.
yeah, yeah. So, by the way, Guthrie, I was teaching a little online workshop session on this whole idea of conceptual models. And you know what I used?
No.
Your the the trains website that you showed me for trains in Spain,
Yeah.
because it was a great example of really bad object decisions that pretty much then made it impossible, pretty almost impossible, to book a train, because it was like you could not figure out what were the objects, what were the views, what were the actions, and I'm not saying that the user would, no, very few users. I'm probably, one of the few people in the world that would be using an app and commenting on the objects and views and actions. So I'm not saying that users will articulate it this way. Um, I remember years ago reading a critique by a very well-known UX person, and I won't say who, but just one of the major UX people, um, who said that metaphors in software don't matter, and it doesn't matter what metaphor you've chosen, uh, because if you've ever done a user test, the user never says this metaphor is wrong. It's like, well, of course they're not going to say this It's like, yeah, objects and views are not important because no user's ever going to say, I don't understand what the object is. Okay, they're not going to say that, but that doesn't mean that this isn't a big problem. So people aren't going to articulate it that way. But whenever someone is looking at a screen and they say things like, what am I doing? What is this? What am I looking at? Okay. That means that there are problems with the conceptual model. And the problems might be that you chose an object that does not make sense to them. That is not the object they wanted to look at, view, take action on. That's one possible problem. And the other possible problem is it is the object they want. Well, there's three problems. The second problem is it is the object they want, but you've named it something goofy that does not match with their mental model. So they're looking at what they want to be looking at, except the name of it, they just get stuck and they're like, what is it? What is a channel? What does that channel? What does that mean? Channel. I don't know what that means. Because you shouldn't have called it channel. You should have called it app.
Right.
What?
I said, yeah.
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 So either you picked the wrong object or you picked the right object, but you gave it the wrong name. Or number three, you have a total mishmash of objects. You have like 7 objects on the screen and they don't know where to look. It's like, wait a minute, what? What am I looking at? Which one? Is that, am I supposed to deal with that or am I supposed to deal with that? So those are really typical object problems. And because, the big problem, Guthrie, with this whole conceptual model thing and objects and views, the main problem is not that you picked a that you made bad object choices or bad naming choices or bad view choices. The problem is you didn't pick anything. You didn't do this consciously at all. You just started creating screens. You didn't think about what their mental model is, what they think these things are, what are the objects they want to deal with. You didn't map out their expected task flow or even create an optimized task flow that might not be what they're used to, but might actually better fit the task they're trying to do. You didn't do any of that stuff. You you came up with your ideas without thinking about the users, or you're just letting the programming structure bubble up and that's becoming, your objects. And um that usually doesn't work. Usually doesn't work. So, so if you want to design a product that is easy to use and easy to learn, you got to take some time to do this conceptual model stuff. You got to think about
Stuff.
objects and views and actions and task flows. And it's hard work. I don't know. I think it's kind of fun, but that just shows you how weird I am.
Mm, yeah.
Do you know the other thing that frustrates people when I teach this to them, especially
Uh,
if they're developers?
what?
There's no one right answer. When I first started teaching this, Guthrie, it was before there were UX people.
Mm.
And so I would be teaching programmers and developers how to do this. And we would do a little exercise and they would come up with, objects and views and actions and map them out. And then they'd look at me and they'd go, "So what's the right answer?" And I would say, "There isn't a right answer." And then they're like, "What do you mean there isn't a right answer?" It's like, no, there's like different ways to do it. And the different ways you'll end up with different interfaces. And some of the interfaces might be more usable than others, but it's not like there's one right way to do it. And that really bothered them. They really wanted to know like the right way.
I think that's very common. People just tell me what the right answer is. You know,
Yeah.
just
So one other thing I want to mention before we leave this, because I know we have just a few minutes left, is it's really important as you come up with these decisions about objects and views and actions. You have to test this with your users. And you can't test it just by saying, hey, here's the objects we think are going to be important to you. And then we were thinking about these views and these actions. Um, you have to do a high level prototype, high level conceptual design prototype to test your flows that use these objects, views, and actions. And that's not hard to do. And it does not have to be detailed. It can be a wireframe. It can be, you know, back in the day, I used to do it with paper and pen and post it notes. Um, in fact, it's better if you don't do it with a high fidelity prototype. Uh, it should look like it's still just being worked on. So sketches are fine. Um, and but you've got to test it out because you might be wrong. You might
Right.
be, the name of it is not quite right, or there's actually another view that you didn't think about that is actually really important to them. Um, or the flow of pages and screens once you've decided on your objects and views is not quite right, and you got to change that. Um, so you have to test it out. And when you're designing screens, by the way, the thing that becomes then actually very easy if you do this, so you do all that conceptual model work, and that's really hard, but you know what's easy if you've done all these pieces up to this point? Design is merely at this point in the task, they want to see the trip object, and they want to see it in the, I'm trying to think of a good example, in the flight option view. So you know exactly what object and what view to show at that point. Now you've got to design that page or screen that is showing that object in that view, but you know what it should be. And you can even define the attributes, what should be on the screen. Oh, well, we got to show the city, the departing city, and the time, and whatever attributes you think are critical to show at that point. You can identify those ahead of time, and then you just draw the screen. So the other thought I want to leave you with is a thought you and I talked about last week that you were like, no, don't want to talk about that. Don't want to go there. But I think these are the inputs into the AI interface design system.
The objects and views.
The objects and views, and objects, views, actions, and attributes, you could feed that into an AI and it would create the screens for you. Dun, dun, dun. So you'll have that all programmed and ready to go next week?
I don't think
No.
so.
So do you think I'm crazy? Well, that's a loaded question, but do you think anybody's going to do this? Objects, views, not the AI stuff, just objects and views and actions and conceptual model design?
No.
Or no? Did you just say no?
No. I think you're right.
But it's
Um,
hard.
but it's hard, and I think it's harder than most people really want to deal with.
People just don't want to work this much.
I think there's an element of that. I mean,
Yeah.
it just takes a lot of, like, everyone. You also have to it's hard to get everyone on board, right?
Yeah.
Hey, the developers, we're designing a thing. It's like, okay, so here's the plan.
Yeah.
Find the nouns in the sentence. I'm like, what is going on? I'm just trying to
Well, you
design
don't
a
have
screen.
to. Okay, you don't always have to go through all of those
No, I
steps,
know, but if it's something
but you
hard and
do.
amorphous, you kind
They're
of,
going to have to.
gonna have to. So I think there is a
But then we're doomed to never have usable apps.
I think, yeah, no kidding. Um,
And this is hard if you don't plan this out ahead of time. This is hard to iterate your way into a good design. It's that's not a particularly efficient. You probably won't get there if you don't design the conceptual model beforehand and you just muddle into a design. You will likely never get into a place where you've actually stumbled upon a good conceptual model design. It's not going to happen. So then I think we're just doomed to have um, software that's hard to use until I can take over the entire thing and do the inputs into the AI. So we just got to wait for me to dominate the world in terms of conceptual model design. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's my take on it, Guthrie.
hmm,
And if you want to do great design, and if you want to do great behavioral design that encourages people to take particular action and to get particular tasks done, this is the magical method. I used to call this when I taught it. Oh, our initial, we have an online video course. It's called Conceptual Model Design. But do you remember or do you know what it was initially called?
something about magic, something.
The Secrets of Intuitive Design.
Secrets.
Yeah, that's what it was called. Yep.
Yeah,
All right. Hey, thank you for listening to me, Guthrie, and to all of our listeners. Thank you for letting me talk on and on and on about this topic. One of my favorite topics. I do encourage you to think about the conceptual design of your product and whether it works well with the mental model of your users. So we'll go all the way back to where we started in our episode last time. That's what we're trying to do, is make that be a good match. All right, Guthrie, I managed to use up an entire hour.
that's fine. That's fine. This is a hard topic, but hopefully people enjoyed it.
And we do teach a workshop on it. Can I put that plug in?
Please, always.
If you want to learn how to do this, let us know.
Yeah,
We'll come teach you.
yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Thank you.
Guthrie. Bye
Bye.
bye.